Okay, everyone, welcome back to Shellac Attack, Jazz Lives, part 2 of our Charlie Parker Centennial series. We have dedicated this series to Phil Schaap, host of Bird Flight and Traditions in Swing. And if you haven't listened to part 1 already, I would go ahead and jump back there. But please enjoy either way. We had a great time with this episode, so check it out.
Charlie Parker's starting to become basically a pop star. He's not quite a superstar yet, and he's not quite as popular as someone like Dizzy Gillespie had become at that point. But he's popular enough to be broadcasting weekly on the radio, and a lot of these broadcasts were broadcast further than just New York City, and so there was a lot of interest in his music from all around the country.
Yeah, and jazz fans in particular, you know, people would rip his recordings from the radio just so they can, like, memorize one of his solos or something.
Exactly.
And it also attracted a lot of young musicians. And I think Miles Davis is a good example of one of those musicians who kind of really took a liking to Charlie Parker and wanted to play with him.
And Miles Davis was really forged in the fires of Charlie Parker's band. He it's funny listening to him, and we'll hear him in a couple more recordings coming up. He plays that he's relatable to, you know, the Miles Davis of kind of blue, but he's sort of still a very young musician who's still very underdeveloped. And Charlie Parker heard something in him that he figured it would be a good foil to Charlie Parker's playing. You know, Charlie Parker has this wizard-like alto saxophone virtuosity. He's, especially at this period, all over the place, playing these amazing lines, so inventive. And Miles Davis is kind of slow-paced and more laid back, and also more restrained compared to Charlie Parker. And so it gives this great sound between the two of them. Even though at the time a lot of people said this Miles Davis guy couldn't play at all. It really took him a few years to come into his own as a great musician.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that, because at the time, Miles Davis was, I think he eventually dropped out of college to play with Charlie Parker or something like that. I think he was going to Juilliard or something, some sort of gifted, like, music college, right? And so he had, like, moved to New York and essentially dropped out to play with Charlie Parker, like, full time. Which, I mean, I totally agree with. College is a little bit of a waste of a time sometimes. But when Miles Davis was playing, you're right, people were like, who is this kid? And because he had such a slow style and also was so new, they thought, he's really hesitant. Like, this is weird. This isn't what bebop is. This isn't what a bebop musician is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he still played it very well. And so next up we'll hear a couple more tracks. We'll do 2 of them in a row as a way of showing you that this is really what Charlie Parker's all about. It's this bebop music played at its most energetic and inventive. So we'll go to Scrapple from the Apple and Donnelly. Both of them are from 1947 by this band, which had Miles Davis, led by Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker's name is finally on the records as the leader, and he's finally in charge with his own group, and he's playing regularly with this group. It's not just a pickup band used for record dates. And so we'll hear 2 of those tracks next.
So that was Scrapple from the Apple and Donna Lee.
Donnelly, and those were both classics. Recorded Scrapple from the Apple on the Dial label, that Ross Russell label, and Donnelly on the Savoy label. And they were both done in 1947, the second half of 1947, when Charlie Parker was leading this quintet. It's been called the Golden Era Bebop 5, the Charlie Parker Quintet, sort of his greatest group. Which initially had Miles Davis and then had a couple of other trumpet players, and other musicians came in and out of it. But it was really Charlie Parker's quintet, and Charlie Parker playing bebop at its greatest. And both of those tunes were sort of new melodies written over the chord progression to old songs, as with some of the previous things we heard, like Groove and High. But it's bebop at its best, I think. It's fast-paced, it's energetic, it's lively, it's bouncy. It's shows a huge amount of virtuosity in the playing. I mean, it's really incredible how well Charlie Parker can play the alto saxophone on those.
Yeah, I think I've often said that Charlie Parker playing a solo is kind of like a magic trick or something. Like, his notes don't touch the ground at times. And I think at first, I don't know if a lot of people would actually like Charlie Parker, because it kind of sounds like right? It's kind of just like this really, really fast. Like, I don't even know what I just heard.
It's a bit like Baroque classical music. It's like there's just so much going on. It's hard to keep track of it sometimes.
Right, but once you, I think, train your ear, I think it requires a little bit of a trained ear. That's why I'm not always so sure that Charlie Parker will always be for everybody. Even though he's like a super skilled musician, that when you finally like have a ground and really look at the music, just what he was able to accomplish like in his solos was just, it was like someone who practiced so hard. He probably put so many hours just to make it look effortless.
And one of the amazing things about Charlie Parker, which is the reason why 100 years from his birth we're still talking about him and still in awe, is that he wasn't just a virtuoso, although he clearly was. I mean, he plays better saxophone than anyone either of us knows, and certainly better than either of us could, even if we practiced for 8 hours a day every day of our lives. It's that...
No, I don't know about that. I'm just kidding.
Is despite that virtuosity, he still has this earthful soul feeling to all of his playing. It still just gets you right in the heart. And it's this amazing combination of playing to the highest level and still making it feel like it's the most pure human emotion just pouring into his horn. And the way he blends those two things is really incredible to me.
Yeah, that's why I think after listening to so much Charlie Parker, like preparing for this episode, I actually related him to Billie Holiday a lot. Strangely, where someone's so talented but soulful, and also just their bad habits of being hard to get along and work with, or just not showing up.
They have parallel lives, and both of their music touch people in similar ways.
Yeah. And so that was just really interesting to see such like a similar story, you know?
Yeah. And one of the fascinating things about Charlie Parker, which is something that you and I both know, but that when people first delve into Charlie Parker, it might not be so obvious, is that this 1947, late 1947, early 1948, into 1948 and 49, this period is Charlie Parker becomes very popular, becomes well known, and he's playing this great music, this bebop, with his own quintet, and making these great sounds. But it's actually not really Charlie Parker at his commercial peak or his. It's not his final evolution. One of the amazing things about Charlie Parker is how, even though he came up with this brand new music, bebop, that changed the world and changed the way people thought about this genre of jazz, he didn't really stop there. He was always thinking about how he could take it to the next level, how he could create something else that was new. And he kept trying out new things. And as he got more and more popular, some of these things really caught on. And one of them was something called Charlie Parker with strings that now sounds not so different to what we might imagine some music might sound like. It's really a product of the pop music of the day, sort of going to these studio, highly produced orchestral records. And it's Charlie Parker playing alto saxophone, and he's got his jazz rhythm section, but then there's 6 other musicians there, 3 violinists, a viola, cello, sometimes a harp player, and they're playing this lush, textured music behind him while he just improvises over these melodies. And it's so different from that Donna Lee or the Scrapple from the Apple you just heard.
And to show you an example of just that, it's a track called Just Friends, from the Charlie with Strings. Little Sweet Cheese.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that was Charlie Parker with Strings, recorded right at the end of 1949, probably released in early 1950. And that's the first track recorded by that group, Just Friends. And it's Charlie Parker with his jazz rhythm section, backed by those strings, and it's completely different to anything he'd done previously. It's really him showcasing himself, playing usually these slower songs, sort of classics of the American songbook, and different repertoire to what he'd played previously. It's not these newfangled bebop lines. It's sort of classic, what was considered classic songs at the time. And the texture's just amazing, the way he's backed by those strings.
Yeah, it really sounds, I think, especially because this is like the first track that he's finally allowed to experiment. And I feel like while bebop was crazy, and I think it was a technical kind of crazy, that this, for some reason, his playing sounds very unweighted. Like he's not weighted by the traditions of jazz anymore.
Yeah, and it's less a technical display and more like pure musical display in some ways.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really,
it sounds like pure music.
It's all focus on himself, but he could do it in a way where he's kind of free to play how he wants. And it's completely different to what he was doing previously. And this was originally done, Charlie Parker had signed with a new record label and a new producer, a guy called Norman Granz, who was much more, let's just say, of an upstanding citizen than his previous producers and label executives, Charlie Parker had. And Norman Granz had, talked about what Charlie Parker wanted to do, and Charlie Parker said he wanted to try out this thing, and it was going to be expensive because you had to hire all these extra musicians. But Norman Granz said, okay, fine, I'll do it as a one-off. And it ended up being huge. It was so popular that Charlie Parker, the record sold so well that Charlie Parker disbanded his quintet and started playing with his Charlie Parker with Strings every day, every night. They had a long run at the Apollo Theater in New York and Harlem. And this is really when Charlie Parker becomes a superstar. This was one of the best-selling records, this Just Friends, of early 1950. And they were released as an early version of an album, which was basically 2 singles stuck together in sleeves in a sort of, an album photo book style thing. And Charlie Parker was hugely popular at the time, and it's mostly thanks to this Charlie Parker with Strings that the broader appeal really came through.
Yeah, and I think after that was so successful, it kind of set like it aligned all of these other opportunities to happen where he experimented with so many different styles. I think once you go into like his later recordings, there's some really weird but really good stuff.
And
For instance, sorry.
and he's just playing around with so
ahead.
many new things. He's really
Yeah.
some things which might sound familiar now were very new at the time, and partly because Charlie Parker was really jumping into it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of Afro-Cuban styles stuff that sounds a little bit like bossa nova.
Yeah, it's sort of a precursor to that sort of Charlie Parker experimenting with blending jazz and Latin music, although it wasn't really called Latin jazz at the time.
Right.
More Afro-Cuban music, and it's partly due to the popularity of this Machito orchestra, which Charlie Parker guest soloed with occasionally, and eventually Charlie Parker got to do for Norman Granz these record dates where he played variety of sort of Latin jazz repertoire, or sort of pre-Latin jazz, and he had another big hit record with it, with a song called My Little Suede Shoes, which we'll hear up next.
And that was My Little Suede Shoes, track 9 on our list. It's really awesome. I am a huge fan of kind of bossa nova-like sounds. So, yeah, it's just so many great things to listen to from this post-1950s like period.
Exactly.
So many great experimentations.
And it's amazing how well Charlie Parker's music fits into this kind of sort of Afro-Cuban sound. He blends it really well, and it's just his quartet with him and his rhythm section augmented by percussion, Latin percussion, basically. That song is an interesting one. It was composer credit given to Charlie Parker, but the melody is lifted from a French vocal group's record that Charlie Parker heard when he was on tour in France in 1949. Only very recently did someone notice that this My Little Suede Shoes might have been quote-unquote borrowed from someone else. But the way he blends it into this sort of alternative rhythm is amazing, and all the repertoire he uses in these Afro-Cuban dates, he's so at ease with it, and it's kind of amazing given that it's not really his musical style.
Yeah, I think it was, I don't know, it feels so out of the box, out of the frame in like a very freeing way.
Definitely. And it's just one of many ways in which in this last few years of his life, he was experimenting with tons of different stuff. Like another example is he switched to a plastic alto saxophone for a period. He liked the sound of it. He liked the texture of it. He was playing with a few different groups, and nothing really recreated the success of Charlie Parker with strings, but he had some more hit records, and he remained very popular for the last 5 years of his life.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Because this was probably the most surprising fact that I learned about Charlie Parker, was that he only lived till he was 34. Right?
Yeah, that's right. He died March 12th of 1955.
That's so young.
It is. It's incredible, and it's incredible how he's really a latecomer to musical creation, and he dies so young. He really has 10 fertile years, or maybe 15 if you count the Jay McShann period, where he's really creating great music, and he undoubtedly burnt the candle at both ends. And when he passed away in 1955, he was in a hotel room and a doctor was called, and the doctor, who didn't know Charlie Parker, estimated his age as at least twice as old as he actually was. I think he put down 60 to 70 on the estimated age. And
That's insane.
Oh, it was 50 to 60, but he was certainly estimated to be a lot older than he actually was. He was a man who had been ravaged by the wrong lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like that was his personality, though. He was like he was I'm not here for a long time, but I'm here for a good
Exactly.
time.
And it was a tragic life in many ways. You know, this drug habit was not a happy thing, I'm sure, and one of the reasons why he had such a fast decline at the end. He was doing pretty well in the early 50s, but his newborn daughter had passed away after just a few months. She'd never been a healthy child in 1953, I think. And this really kind of sent Charlie Parker into a tailspin. And you can hear a change in his playing, something of a despair or a lack of control. And there's fewer and fewer recordings of him into 1954, and actually you can't hear him at all in 1955. Sadly, there's nothing that survives.
Right. Well, I mean, you say there's nothing that survives, but there are people that survive.
That's true.
Charlie Parker.
Yeah, and it's one of the things with Charlie Parker is how influential he was to anyone and everyone who played with him, and also people who didn't play with him and who just heard him play in this period, and who he helped develop into their identity for musicians. And, we talked a lot about Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie's collaboration and creating this new music bebop. And it was really, one of the great things about this bebop thing is it's really both of them equally and together that did it. It's kind of rare for there to be an innovation that you can attribute as much to one person or another. And I think now people tend to focus more on Parker, maybe because of this lifestyle that is much more, it makes for a more memorable story. But Dizzy Gillespie was the guy who was working every day and creating these bands and writing the songs, and he could play just as well as Charlie Parker could. And one of the things they did together was they realized that they needed more than just the two of them if they were going to play this music. And so they trained this whole generation of musicians, or exposed these musicians to the way that they thought music should go. And then those musicians sometimes took it even further. Some of them felt that, Charlie Parker was the greatest and that no one would ever do it better than him, but a lot of them thought it was just the starting point.
Right.
And I think that's why Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie's music is so familiar to us now, is because jazz as we know it today is so indebted to them. It's so indebted to this bebop style. No one really plays bebop that much anymore, but all jazz styles today come out of it, or they have evolved from it.
Right.
And so some of the musicians who were around and who really took a lot from Charlie Parker, people like Miles Davis, who we've mentioned, and the great drummer Max Roach, who was perhaps not as well known today, but as a great figure of the 1960s, and who was on a lot of those Charlie Parker recordings that we heard, and who later on was a big part of the civil rights movement and of making music that meant something, and music for social change. And he was also a great believer in training younger musicians, and he always had a band of younger musicians playing with him. And Miles Davis, who took this bebop and then took it to many different places. He created modal jazz and something of what we now call hard bop, which is sort of more traditional jazz music of today, and free jazz and things like that. And Miles Davis, who started out in Charlie Parker's world and was propelled into his own identity, then took it to lots of different places. And then there's even some musicians still alive today, like the great Sonny Rollins, who started out listening to Charlie Parker and really created his identity based on Charlie Parker, and then eventually evolved into his own person.
Yeah, he touched so many people's lives. And just one person we didn't mention yet was Frank Morgan, who I idolized Charlie Parker from an extremely young age and met him at an extremely young age and was known as Charlie Parker's successor. And he was also influenced by Charlie's drug lifestyle, and Frank Morgan ended up in prison. But eventually, when he was definitely this person who cycled in and out of like the system, but eventually he went on to teach so many young musicians. And I think he only died maybe in like, I don't remember, I think it was like 2006 or 2010 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that later generation of musicians, or the jazz musicians of the second half of last century, so many of them took so much from Charlie Parker's music. And people like Frank Morgan had a similar story to someone who we now know better, John Coltrane, who also started his musical career just imitating Charlie Parker solos. And the first recording that exists of John Coltrane is him just trying badly to sound like Charlie Parker. And eventually, he also came into his own personality and musical identity. And that's why we love him. But Charlie Parker was this inspiration to so many in music and so many outside of music.
Yeah, so much so that after he died, the people wrote probably one of the most famous like graffitis of all time, which was "Bird Lives."
Bird Lives, that's right.
Yeah, and so that remained very true, and I think the talent of Charlie Parker was not just like his playing, because obviously he had to practice a lot to like get there, but I think his natural intuition of just having to constantly evolve as a musician and constantly wanting to try different avenues. After hard bop, well, he went to so many other places.
Exactly. And it's a shame that so many of them didn't quite get realized fully because of his short life, but he was always trying to push the envelope, and there are recollections and the interviews of him that survived, that were recorded. He's always thinking about the next thing and how he could just take it a little bit further and yet be at the center of it all. And one of the last experiments of Charlie Parker is this interesting recording session for Norman Granz. It was done in 1953. And it's Charlie Parker, in a similar way to with Charlie Parker with strings, kind of experimenting with texture and saying, instead of having the strings, what if it was voices? What if we tried something with a vocal group and a big band at the same time? And it never really came to fruition. The arranger, Gil Evans, put together something based on Charlie Parker's limited instructions, and because it wasn't really that well rehearsed, it ended up not really going anywhere. But nothing else has ever been quite made like it. And it just shows this great imagination of Charlie Parker and how he thrived in these environments. So we'll hear, as the last track of this discussion, Old Folks from that date.
Okay, so that was Old Folks, our last track. And it was described in an interview that I found on the site Jazzwax. They have an interview of Hal McKusick, and he was the clarinetist at that recording session. And Hal described it as just a total mess.
Yeah, it was not very well rehearsed. It was not very well put together. There are far too many people in that room at once, and no one really knows what they're doing or what's going on.
Right.
And you can hear there's thankfully the whole session was recorded, including a lot of studio discussion and chatter, and you can hear the frustration in the Norman Granz, the producer's voice, as things clearly are not going very well, and he's paid for about 20 people to be in the room for 4 hours, and it was they were struggling to get anything they could use, or there was of high enough, production standard that they could release it commercially.
Yeah, and he was saying in the interview how he just didn't understand why they wouldn't do a take without the vocals. Because from Hal's perspective, the vocals is what was messing it up, because they just had too many people on the vocals. And so a lot of the vocals had to be doubled up because there's only so many vocal parts you can write.
Yeah.
And David Lambert, who... this was like the Lambert singers,
That's right, yeah. It was David Lambert, who is better known for the later Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, and this is his earlier group, the Dave Lambert Singers.
Yeah, so he was in charge of writing the vocal parts. Annie Ross is actually in this recording.
Funnily enough, Annie Ross later said that she wasn't in the recording, so it's unclear whether she's there or not. But Dave Lambert is definitely there.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention Annie Ross because she
passed away
recently. Last
Yeah.
month. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So, if you don't know about David Lambert was pretty much a singer and a part of singing groups. And him and Charlie Parker were actually friends. And they met at the Royal Roost in the 1940s. So they had already been friends for or known about each other at least for 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's said also in this interview that David Lambert might have just coaxed Charlie Parker into trying it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other side of the story is that Charlie Parker asked Gil Evans, a great arranger, to put together this date, or to write music for this date, but he gave him very limited information as to what he wanted. And so basically Gil Evans came up with something that sounds a bit like the Claude Thornhill Orchestra, but with a different kind of introduction and with Charlie Parker added in. And it's kind of, no matter what, the vision, I think the problem was that the vision was not a unified one. It was Gil Evans and Dave Lambert trying to figure out what Charlie Parker wanted without really any instructions, and Charlie Parker just deciding to play how he wanted to inside all this mess. But the amazing thing about that recording is, as messy as it is from a performance perspective, Charlie Parker plays some of the best music he's ever played on that.
Yeah, it's definitely overly ambitious. But I think it's really impressive. Old Folks is one of my favorite songs in general.
Yeah,
so.
And it's a beautiful song, and it's great to hear Charlie Parker play that way.
Yeah,
and it's a good song to use to close out our little chat on Charlie Parker. I hope that we've brought you some useful information, some great information, and hopefully through the music you've got a bit of a better appreciation for what he was about and how it went with the Yardbird.
Yeah, it was, I think, from my perspective, I pretty much learned all about Charlie Parker while putting together this episode with you. I think before this, I probably couldn't even name a track that he played on. But now I know a lot.
Yeah.
And it is kind of hard to nail down because they're musicians in this time period travel so much.
And it's difficult to, you and I had this discussion about what's the best way to listen to Charlie Parker in 2020, because the way Charlie Parker made music in the day was these recording sessions would produce 4 songs every recording date, and they would be released as singles with the way we would think about 45 RPM discs today, but they were actually 10-inch shellac discs, but with one song on each side, and they'd be released individually as singles, and there were no real albums And although it's something Charlie Parker started to think about just before he died, and the music was released piecemeal, and it's nowadays compiled back into these best of or compilation CDs or sort of things from years apart mixed together with no context, and it's hard to approach the music without any previous knowledge, especially because with Charlie Parker, there's so much of it.
Yeah, and like I was saying before, if you have no prior knowledge of like jazz in general, or like have a good trained ear for like very complex solos and stuff, I don't know if everybody would feel confident jumping into Charlie Parker.
Exactly.
Or even just understanding like, why is this guy good? It just sounds like jazz.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think there's a bunch of great like compilation albums now, or, you know, if you want to listen to Charlie Parker with strings, you can listen to all of the takes together. You know, you don't have to listen to it single by single like you did back in the day. Yeah, and I think I learned a lot about, I don't know, kind of the classic tale of a musician like burning out. It's a very classic, like almost like a rock and roll story.
It is.
Strangely.
And it's ends tragically, but it's great that there was so much great work in there that Charlie Parker gave us so much. And I think one of the things that I hope and I find when I introduce people to Charlie Parker is, despite the fact that it's hard to delve into and hard to pierce this dense mass that is the Charlie Parker discography and all the recordings that survive, you still get that experience when you listen to him playing the alto saxophone that is just great. It's so enjoyable to listen to, and it's very rare that I hear anyone say that they've both listened to Charlie Parker and don't like it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's just, I don't know, there's so much. I feel like this could be such a bigger series.
It could.
There's a lot to cover in only 34 years of someone's life. And I only wish I could have a life so memorable like that.
It would,
you know?
It would be a great thing to dedicate your life to doing, and some people have done it. And makes me a little jealous sometimes.
Yeah, your life's not spicy enough.
It's not spicy enough to be all Charlie Parker all the time.
All right. So, I don't know. I guess we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Thank you for listening, and we'll be listening to more jazz with you sometime soon, I hope.
Yeah.
Keep it jazzy.
Okay, so we are Shellac Attack. This episode is called Jazz Lives, Part 2 of our Charlie Parker Centennial series. We're a podcast from Jam Eater Records. We're going to put out one of these every month. And our theme music is composed by Steve Arnold and performed by Fiasco. Our additional intermission music is by ambient artist Max High. Any interviews or research we mentioned are linked in the show notes. This is dedicated to Phil Schaap, host of Bird Flight and Traditions in Swing, our mentor, our friend, and someone who is always encouraging young people to join the Neo-Hot Club movement. Just want to remind you that Bird lives, and if Bird lives, jazz lives too. Thank you.